All right, let's get started. My name is Kristen Vanderlucht, and I'm the office manager for the clerk's office. I'm filling in for Sarah Alanis, who can't be here tonight, but will return next week for the in-person session on Tuesday and the virtual session on Wednesday. Tonight's presentation is all about the transportation department and will be presented by the transportation manager, Raymond Hess. You can ask questions throughout this presentation in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and Raymond will answer them at some point during his presentation. Let's see. A reminder that these sessions are recorded and will be available for later viewing on the Community Academy webpage under the 2023 schedule tab. All right, Raymond, the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you, Kristen. Let's see, Kristen, can you give me a thumbs up? Is my screen sharing properly? All right, very good. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Raymond Hess. As Kristen mentioned, I'm the transportation manager for the city. My contact information is here on the screen. If you have a follow-up question that comes to mind after we're done, by all means, feel free to reach out. As Kristen said, feel free to type questions in the Q&A chat on Zoom. Because I'm one of those people that can't walk and chew gum at the same time, I might save those questions and addressing them towards the end. So I'll just kind of run through the PowerPoint and then, circle back with questions. And if I have to refer back to a slide, that's not a problem. All right, so let's jump into it. So the presentation is meant to be kind of framed with some fun quotes, or at least quotes that I think are apropos to the subject at hand. So really what I want to do is, kind of give some background about transportation, just the conditions in Ann Arbor, what makes Ann Arbor kind of unique, and then talk through some of the things that we're doing moving forward. So the first one really talks about kind of the travel patterns about Ann Arbor, using this quote from Yogi Berra. It's always funny, I get comments like this all the time, like, I'm never going to go downtown again, it's too crowded. And it's like, well, obviously it's crowded, we're doing something right. So and that's the DDA and a whole bunch of other partners, the downtown merchants and everything. So in terms of now, I will say a lot of the data that I'm going to present to you is pre-pandemic. We still kind of don't know exactly what post-pandemic is, if we're in the new normal, or if some of those travel patterns and employment patterns and housing patterns are still shifting. So, take some of this with a grain of salt. It may predate, 2020 or so, but, this still guides a lot of our assumptions and a lot of our work moving forward. So one of the things that's interesting about Ann Arbor, I'm sure many of you know, we have a population right around 120,000. But every day we have roughly, 84,000 people that come into town to work and recreate. And then, obviously on game days or things like that, that number may swell to doubling our population. We'd have a lot of circulation within the community as well, especially for, journey to work type things, roughly 25,000. And then we have a lot of people that live within the community that, commute outside of the community to jobs elsewhere. Again, this is a big grain of salt on this because I know with telecommuting and work from home, some of these patterns have shifted a little bit. So when we look at that, we really try to hone in on, what our population is doing, how far people are going, and, what kind of transportation options we can provide to folks. So, for example, when we look at this graphic here, nearly half of people are traveling less than 10 miles in terms of their commuting distance. And so when you think about that in terms of what modes of transportation you could use, the bus could definitely be in your solution set. Driving a vehicle could be within your solution set. And then, depending upon how far, it may even be biking or walking. We have a very high percentage of people that walk within our community, well beyond the national average. And so, that's to be expected in a college town. Obviously a lot of people live and work on or near campus. And so, that accounts for a lot of those travel behaviors, but also explains why we think it's important to provide a lot of transportation options to people. Next, what I want to do is kind of frame about some of the history of if you build it and they will come. And I really like this quote by Robin Chase, co-founder of Zipcar, where infrastructure is destiny, because it it almost is more impactful than Build It and They Will Come. It really talks about, influencing kind of the build of a community and influencing what people's decisions are based on what you build for them. So looking back over history from 2013 to 2017, there were increases in hours of transit service that were provided. There were upgrades to pedestrian infrastructure as well as bike facilities. And we see that manifesting in our travel patterns over time. So ridership on transit grew during that time, as well as the percentage of people that bike and walk. And more importantly, our emissions went down as a result. And that is kind of shown in this next graphic as well. Again, in similar timeframes from 2009 to 2017, we experienced some population growth. We had some modest job growth, but then we saw a huge growth in, or a notable growth, I should say, in sustainable modes of transportation, and actually a decrease in people who were using single occupancy vehicles to get around. And so this is important. Keep this stuff in mind as we get further down in the presentation, because the city has some fairly aggressive goals when it comes to transportation in terms of how we want to reduce the vehicle miles traveled. In other words, how much people drive in the community, and then shifting the remaining trips over to clean electric vehicles. There's oftentimes this idea that we can build our way out of congestion, and that has since been disproven time and time again. And this was even realized by an urban planner in, I think, the 50s, who Lewis Mumford has a lot of great quotes. This one's one of my favorite, that pretty much kind of speaks to this fact that really transportation is about moving people. It's not about moving cars. And so how we frame that is really important for the decisions we make, the sort of infrastructure we build, and the choices that we give people. So to kind of put the driving thing into context, when the acronym here, VMT, if you're not familiar with that, stands for vehicle miles traveled. That's kind of the aggregate of all the car trips that are happening and all the vehicle trips that are happening in a community. However, when you think about how many of those are experiencing delay, the majority of those are not during AM or PM rush hour, the morning rush hour or the evening rush hour. So this kind of speaks to what, in another planning term, we think of like the Black Friday parking. Do you build a parking lot for that one day out of the year when every shopper may show up, or does it make sense to approach a more balanced, approach when it comes to parking, where you don't need to acquire acres and acres of land for parking that's not used 364 days out of the year? Same thing we think about when there's in the transportation network. Yes, there are congestion issues, especially in the AM and PM peak or the morning and evening rush hour. But that's pretty much the isolated incidences that we experience here in Ann Arbor. For those of you who've experienced, real congestion in other communities like LA or Chicago, I think you might agree that when people complain about traffic in Ann Arbor, it's really relative, and it's really not all that bad. But where we do want to pay a lot of close attention is safety. I'll go into a little bit more detail on this later. The city is what's known as a Vision Zero community. Vision Zero refers to the idea that traffic crashes, especially fatal and incapacitating or serious crashes, are preventable, and we should strive to achieve zero fatal or serious crashes within our community. And so this graphic and the next one kind of speak to this, that the majority of our crashes happen on roads that are 35 miles per hour or higher, but yet they only account for a small percentage of our streets at 15%. Similarly, the number of lanes of a roadway is another determinant. So, the percentage of severe crashes on roads that have 4 lanes or more is 40%, whereas that only represents about 7% of all of the street miles that we have within the city. So we know where the problems are. We're going to kind of talk a little bit more later about what we're doing to address that. The mayor of Bogota was also a fairly progressive urban planner and really, emphasized this idea of transit. That if you're not familiar with the term bus rapid transit, Bogota was really a pioneer in getting bus rapid transit to really move as many people around as possible. And so to show this graphically, if you think about especially a single occupancy vehicle, just a single driver in a single car, it's not a very good efficient use of the roadway, right? You can move roughly 600 to 1,600 people per hour. If you add buses to the mix, if they're in mixed flow, you can add some capacity along that roadway with the people who are on the buses, because you have multiple people on those buses, but it still is not really maximizing the efficiency of the roadway. If we take that same lane of travel and if we were to convert that to a sort of bike path, the number of bicyclists that could use that facility, is almost tenfold to what you could put through on private vehicles. And this has been well documented in places like Portland. If you have a dedicated transit lane where, just buses are running down that lane because, again, passengers can be pretty compact on a bus, you can increase the efficiency of that lane of travel even more. And believe it or not, pedestrians, because pedestrians can be very compact, you can move a lot of people in a small space, especially, the width of a roadway. And we have very high pedestrian volume areas here in town, especially around campus. So, this number, some may look at it and say, oh, there's no way, 8,000, 9,000 people per hour would use a sidewalk. Well, it actually is a possibility. I moved out here from Las Vegas, and I can tell you that, like on the Las Vegas Strip, this, in fact, are the sorts of numbers we would look at just based on the pedestrian volumes. And then lastly, the highest, most efficient use of the transportation infrastructure is some sort of like fixed guideway, whether that's bus rapid transit or light rail or, something like that, just because you can squeeze so many people into those facilities. And to kind of show that differently, you have this graphic. So on the far right, you have a picture of, well, it's all the same block. The first shows, what it would take to fit roughly 60 people. If they were all in their vehicle, they would take up the entire block. If they were all on bicycles, they take up, about a third of the block. And if they're all in a bus, those 60 people, it's just one bus length. So you can just graphically and visually see how we use the space and how we allocate a lot of our public infrastructure and roadways to a form of transportation, the single occupancy vehicle, that's not really the highest and best use of that roadway. Now, granted, there are a lot of freedom that come with single occupancy vehicles, so I'm not here to car bash. I'm just kind of giving you some visual representation about how we're trying to kind of balance our transportation approach here in Ann Arbor. Looking at transit, luckily and thankfully to the voters of Ann Arbor, there's a new transit millage that was passed, so you're going to see a lot of improvements in this space. But when we talk about transit, what are some of the shortcomings, right? So for a community of our size, we have a very good transit system, but it really does focus on sort of the morning rush hour and the evening rush hour, and then the service kind of fluctuates during the midday and then drops off pretty quickly at night. Now, thanks to the transit millage that was passed last August, which will take effect in 2024, if I'm not mistaken, you're going to start seeing some improvements to service, both in terms of frequency, in terms of coverage, and in terms of reliability. So some of these numbers are going to really improve. So when we say that only 16% of jobs are accessible from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., I suspect that number is going to greatly improve over time. Jane Jacobs, if you're familiar with urban planning at all, this is a very popular name. She wrote a famous book, The Life and Death of American Cities, and in New York, there's the Robert Moses about how a lot of freeways were just being neighborhoods were being torn down in favor of freeways, and Jane Jacobs kind of led a grassroots movement in opposition to that. And so the idea here is, we really want to make sure that the options that we're providing are for everybody, that we're not just focusing on, certain types of individuals with certain abilities or whatever the case may be. We have to be holistic and encompassing and make sure that nobody's really left behind by our transportation system. One of the things that we look at in this space has to do with what we call the Housing and Transportation Affordability Index. This is a common measure that we use in planning to really see what the impact is on people's household income when it comes to housing and transportation. These are very, kind of basic needs. And so, the higher the percentage, the less discretionary income that people have to put towards other things like, leisure activities or maybe even essential things like daycare and things like that. And so really looking at this is an important metric for us. And, we compare pretty well to communities, other college communities and communities in Michigan. I think some of you might be looking at this and scratching your head saying, well, housing is pretty expensive in Ann Arbor. And as an Ann Arbor resident, I understand your point of view. But, some of our transportation costs are maybe lower because we do have options. We do have abilities for people to take the bus or walk or bike or not pay, to drive and park if they have that option. The other thing we really are trying to be more and more mindful of is equity needs. So, are there populations that have historically been disenfranchised? Are there populations that have not had equal access or equitable access to different parts of the community, whether that be, to food, to recreation, to jobs? And so one of the things that we look very closely at when we approach a lot of these projects now is we have an equity needs analysis. This is based on household income, car ownership, a whole number of different metrics go into this equity needs map. And we want to make sure that we're being sensitive to that as we plan our projects and programs moving forward. I teed this up a little bit earlier. What we follow very closely the crash patterns in the city. And this is also an equity consideration because when you think about people who might be walking, biking, or taking transit, some may be doing so out of choice, but some may be doing so out of necessity. Owning a car is an expensive endeavor. And so a lot of times people who are walking and biking, especially are particularly vulnerable to crashes. And so, if you think about, what we're trying to achieve as a Vision Zero community, we pay a lot of attention to trying to make sure that we ensure the safety of everybody on our roadways, with particular emphasis on people who walk, bike, and take transit because they are so vulnerable if they're involved in a crash. This kind of shows the same thing I just said, which is, if you look at the percentage of workers who walk or bike to work, it's around 20%. However, the percentage of people that are injured are 36%, and the number of people killed is 53% if they're walking or biking. So the point here is that there's a disproportionate amount of crashes that involve bicyclists and pedestrians, especially serious and fatal crashes. And the things that we can do to help minimize that are, reducing speeds and giving people safer and more comfortable options when it comes to biking and walking, making sure that we have safe crossings. And again, I'll get into a little bit more detail in a little bit. All right. This next quote has been kind of changed over time. I think many of you recognize this as "be the change you want to see in the world." After doing some research, that's not actually what Mahatma Gandhi said. It was this. But the idea is we all have a role to play. We all have responsibility in this space. We, no matter what our mode of transportation is, we need to be mindful of what we're doing. And then we also have to be thoughtful about, what choices we make, because that does influence the greater community as a whole. So as I said before, the transportation plan is a Vision Zero plan. So we are focused on 0 deaths and 0 serious crashes. But our plan is also tied to the carbon neutrality plan, the A20 plan, which calls for 0 emissions. So our target for 0 deaths on our roadways is by 2025, and 0 emissions is by 2030, if I'm not mistaken. So really, we're trying to accomplish these things in tandem, and they're both heavy lifts, but we do think they are achievable. We have the technology, we have the know-how. We just have to have the fortitude to come forth and do this. And again, like I said before, we all have a role to play in this. Speaking to the A20 plan, you can see kind of the two major strategies that guide this work. Strategy 2 talks about switching our appliances and vehicles over to electric. So then that way, those are not emitting pollutions. But that's only half of the strategy. The other half of the strategy is to reduce the miles traveled by at least 50%. Switching those modes over to bicycling, walking, taking transit, or scooters, or other more sustainable forms of transportation. And then this is how we can achieve our carbon neutrality. The transportation space, if I understand it correctly, I know the numbers moved around a little bit, but represents over 20% of our emissions in the community. And so it's not, it's a fairly significant thing to solve for. And so making sure that we have these strategies in place is important to help guide the work that we do. Now, transitioning over to the transportation plan that my team and I oversee, I wanted to give you just a quick snapshot of some of the things that we're working on. The plan is organized around kind of 5 pillars, and those are, as you can see on the screen. It's obviously anchored in this idea of safety. The title of the plan is Ann Arbor Moving Together Towards Vision Zero. Vision Zero is a safety initiative, and safety is kind of at the forefront of everything we do. But then we also want to look at mobility. We want to make sure that we're giving people those choices. We want to make sure we're addressing accessibility for all, so that again, certain populations aren't being left behind. We want to make sure we have healthy people in sustainable places. This is a direct connection to the A20 carbon neutrality plan. And then regional connectivity. One of the first slides I showed you kind of showed this idea that we lead regional lives. Many people commute into and out of our community every day. And so we can't just pretend that our work is done at city borders, even though our jurisdiction may end there. We know we have to engage other regional partners to kind of advance some of the goals if we're ever going to achieve what we've set out to achieve. So I'll just walk through a couple examples under each of these. So in the safety space, we monitor our crashes pretty closely. A lot of the data that I'm going to show you from this point forward is a little bit more updated. So this is our crash data for Ann Arbor. And you'll see that, in 2020, there was a dip. This kind of represents the onset of the pandemic. We've kind of internally joked, even though it may not be funny, but when the pandemic hit, what seemed to be the unobtainable goal of reaching 50% vehicle miles traveled was achieved overnight. For those of you that went out on March 14th, 2020, which was the day after everything shut down, there was barely a car to be seen on the road. Nobody was out. And that's what the roads would look like if we had achieved 50% VMT. And if you did have a chance to experience that, you could kind of imagine what you could repurpose roadways for, or at least lanes of roadways, especially where we have multi-lane roadways. You could think, oh, well, there isn't that much traffic on this road anymore. We could put in, dedicated bus lanes. We could put in dedicated bicycle facilities, or widen the sidewalk, or whatever the case may be. And given the amount of traffic that was on the road, that would still serve the needs of people and vehicles, but then also serve maybe to a better extent people on buses or bikes or on foot or in wheelchairs. So it is something, if you can think back that far and if you can imagine it, it does seem possible. But then when it comes to safety, we also saw some downturns in some of the crashes. Now, this trend is actually kind of surprising because most of the country saw a notable uptick, especially in serious and incapacitating crashes, because what many communities saw across the country were, since there was less traffic on the roadway, it invited people to speed, which led to dangerous behaviors, which then led to more severe crashes. Luckily, we did not see that uptick in our serious crashes. And we've been holding steady stubbornly at around where this past for 2022, we just crunched the number, or no, I'm sorry, for 2021, we finalized the numbers. We had 17 fatal and incapacitating crashes, which is 17 too many, but it does feel within reach for us to get that down to 0 by 2025. Some of the things that we're doing in this space, at the onset of the pandemic, we instituted a measure called leading pedestrian intervals citywide. So what a leading pedestrian interval does is it gives the pedestrians and people in wheelchairs kind of a head start to the green light turning for motor vehicles. And the idea is this gives pedestrians higher prominence and visibility in the roadway, especially for cars that are turning right or left. The pedestrians are less likely to get clipped. And we think we're seeing some real positive gains related to intersection safety for pedestrians as a result of this. A lot of the research nationally suggests this is a proven countermeasure, and that seems to be playing out here as well. Another thing that we're doing is an initiative called Quick Builds. Historically, when we did transportation improvements, we would always kind of wait for some major capital project to happen. So let's say, a water main underground had to be fixed, so they tore up the road, and when it was put back, then we would kind of go in and see how we could reconfigure the roadway or make things better. Or if there was a resurfacing project, we would see if we could squeeze in bike lanes or whatever the case may be. However, we've realized now that waiting for a major capital project, we might wait a long time because not many roads are touched in any given year just because of the cost. So we're gravitating towards a quick build approach, which is with readily available materials such as paint and little plastic posts that you can put in the road, we can do a lot more improvements in a very quick amount of time instead of waiting for a major street to be reconstructed. So we started to implement some of these last year. Then we ran out of time with the seasons. We're going to finish those up this year. The ones that you see on the map will be finished up this year. And then we're going to broaden that even further this year going forward. We did just get some additional funding. Again, the voters of Ann Arbor passed a climate millage to support the A20 carbon neutrality plan. Some of that money will be set aside for transportation improvements, especially non-motorized transportation like bicycling and walking. We also just got another big federal discretionary grant called Safe Streets for All to the tune of $3.8 million. And a good portion of that is going to go to quick build deployments as well. So we're pretty excited to have an infusion of cash to kind of move these initiatives forward. The plan identifies a lot of good opportunities and places where these can be put in. And so we're working with a consultant team right now to help identify those locations and design what those countermeasures could be to achieve the safety results that we hope to achieve. Related to mobility, you've seen a lot more development of our bike infrastructure. The thinking around bike infrastructure has changed. I've been doing transportation planning for 20 plus years now, and we used to be really proud of ourselves when we would put in a bike lane, just a single stripe on the road and bicycle symbol, and we thought job was done. But as we learn more about really what attracts people to biking, while a bike lane will work for some people, it may not work for everyone. So when I, talking about myself, I feel comfortable biking on bike lane because I'm a fairly confident cyclist. But when I have my 11-year-old daughter with me, depending upon the condition of the roadway, depending upon how fast cars are going, how much volume of traffic there is, I may not feel comfortable biking in just a single striped bike lane with my daughter. So the facility that you see on the picture on the left is one of our downtown cycle tracks that was put in by the Downtown Development Authority. So big shout out to them. These are a high comfort facility, or what we call an all ages and abilities bike facility. So it's physically separated from traffic. This one in particular has a concrete curb. You can see the plastic posts, or what we call delineators, are also put throughout as well. And the bicyclists have kind of their own dedicated lane. This is a sort of bi-directional cycle track. Not all not all high comfort facilities will be like this. There might just be a bike lane that has, buffers with the delineators, those plastic posts. That might be one solution set, or there might be others. But we are moving towards a facility type that it can encourage more people onto bikes and into bike lanes where they are separated from traffic. Another thing that we're trying to work with the Ride on right now is a transit signal priority project. The Ride had gotten some grant funding a couple years ago, and so we are currently working with them on a design that pretty much what this does is a signal can sense when a bus is coming, and then we can either hold the green light for that bus to make it through the intersection so that they don't get caught at the red light, or we can signal it to trip sooner if it is at a red light. So The idea is this would improve on-time performance and would kind of improve the reliability of transit. This is especially a good first step before we get to things like dedicated transit lanes. We don't have a lot of multi-lane roads in the city. That was a slide I showed earlier. We only had, what, 5% or something of the roads were multi-lane. But this is a good interim measure where we can put transit signal priority to help our transit system out. Accessibility for all. We really are looking at ways we can improve our crossings in the city. So many of you have probably encountered these yellow pedestrian signs that have the embedded yellow lights. Those are called rectangular rapid flashing beacons, or RRFBs. We find that the compliance on these is, while not perfect, is better than not having the flashing yellow lights. And with the more and more deployment of these throughout town, they seem to be more readily recognized and hopefully better adhered to, especially by motorists. I cross some of these every day, and my experience has largely been positive. Every once in a while, you have to obviously pay attention before you step out into the roadway. That's my duty as a pedestrian, to ensure my safety, to make sure that the motorist sees me. But once they do, I feel confident that those yellow flashing lights really bring attention to my presence there. The other thing that we're working on, the other thing to note here too, is whenever we develop crosswalks, we always make sure they're accessible. So we make sure that the ramps are level so that people in wheelchairs have a nice gradual approach. We also put in these little pads. If you've seen those little red pads that have the little bumps on them, those are sometimes called truncated domes. That helps people with visual impairments, especially if they have canes and things like that. They know that they're up at the edge of where the crosswalk meets the roadway. And those signals also have an audible feature, so that when you push the button, it says yellow lights are flashing, which is a signal to people with visual disabilities that they can cross the road once that button is pushed. Another thing to note about accessibility for all is we've been very fortunate, again, thanks to the voters of Ann Arbor. They did pass a sidewalk millage a couple years ago, which generates $1.3 million per year. And we put this towards filling in sidewalk gaps. Sidewalks are a crucial part of our transportation infrastructure. In my profession, we like to say every trip begins and ends as a pedestrian, no matter what form of transportation you're using. Even if you're getting into a car, you don't jump out of bed into your car. And then when you get to your destination, you're probably not in your car as well. So you have to get out of your car. So making sure that our pedestrian infrastructure is complete is important to us. It serves not just the able-bodied, but people in wheelchairs and people with visual disabilities. So we want to make sure that we fill as much of the sidewalk network as possible. So there's still a long way to go. There's 142 miles almost, but we're knocking away at it. Year over year, we're putting out $1.3 million towards that. And there's a whole list of projects. There's a dashboard. You can see if you live on a street that has a sidewalk gap, we have a very kind of data-driven approach in terms of how we prioritize that work and where those funds go. Healthy people in sustainable places. This was a project that was done back in 2018. This is the North Maple Road Diet, or road reconfiguration. So you may recall North Maple used to be 2 lanes in each direction. 2 lanes in each direction actually poses a bit of a challenge for a couple of reasons. Believe it or not, it can be a fairly ineffective or inefficient for motorists, because what happens is if anyone is turning from any lane, let's say you're in kind of the middle lanes. If you're turning left to turn into the Peace Neighborhood Center, which is in this area, all the cars behind you are backed up. And so then they're swerving into the right lane to get around you. Conversely, if there's a bus in the right-hand lane, or if there is someone turning into a side street, you have cars weaving around the other direction. So up to certain traffic volumes, we actually find that a road diet or road reconfiguration like what you see on the right is actually more efficient, where you have 1 lane in each direction with a center turn lane, because that center turn lane can get vehicles out of the flow of traffic. So again, if there was a left turning vehicle, it would be in that center lane and the cars could go through. But the added benefit of road diets is several things. One, it gives us extra space that we can put, a buffered bike lane in, like in this instance. And then the fun thing about this buffered bike lane is we hope to upgrade it to a protected bike lane here this year, where we would put plastic posts in that buffer area. Obviously, we wouldn't block driveways and we wouldn't block people's access to their destinations, but putting in that physical separation will make that facility that much more comfortable. The other thing to note here too is the pedestrian crossing is better. When you have two lanes in each direction, you are exposed to what we call the multi-threat crash, where one car may stop, but the other car may not see a pedestrian crossing and will continue through. And that sort of visual obstruction happens a lot when you have a pedestrian crossing on a multi-lane road. Whereas when you have a road diet, there's only one vehicular lane in each direction. And so when that car stops, the pedestrian has you reduce the number of conflict points, and then the motorists have a better sight line on the pedestrians. Some other things that we're doing in the Healthy People and Sustainable Places is giving people additional transportation options, even with private entities. So we've had e-scooters in the communities with Spin since April of 2019. So we're coming up on the 4-year mark, and we are actually taking a proposal to council on March 20th to introduce dockless e-bikes as well. Spin has an e-bike in their fleet that they can roll out. We've been in negotiations with them for a while, and we are taking a proposal to council on March 20th to see if they agree to bring about 100 e-bikes to the community as well for a pilot. So if that gets approved, there will be yet another kind of new form of transportation. It's a dockless e-bike system, similar to what the scooters are now. We're going to monitor it to see how, if it's serving the needs while not creating a nuisance for others, and making sure that it's successful. So stay tuned for that. It's another kind of possible exciting development. Healthy streets, if you were around here in 2020 when the pandemic first hit, you may have seen we piloted and experimented with a lot of things. You heard me say earlier that traffic was down. People were wanting to social distance. We also knew that people wanted to get out and kind of recreate and do, healthier forms of transportation. So we tried several different configurations on the roadway. So we worked with the DDA, the Downtown Development Authority, as well as outside of the downtown on several different reconfigurations, some of which have become permanent. So good example is if you've seen the bike lane on South Main Street from Stadium to William, that started off as a Healthy Street pilot. Same thing with the Division cycle track. Division was at first just a kind of cone and barrel type deployment. And then after that was tested, we saw that, the world didn't come to an end and it seemed to be working. So that one was made permanent as well. Similar things happened on Packard too. So there's a lot of interest from our team and others on kind of these iterative approaches of piloting things, trying them before you buy them. And if they seem to be working, then we move towards implementing them and making them permanent. Regional connectivity, again, this is one of these things where we really love to work with our partners. We have a very good working relationship with the university, with the RIDE. And so you heard me say earlier, the voters approved a millage back in August of last year that takes effect in 2024. That's going to start off by really improving the experience of the existing system by increasing frequencies, increasing the, how late in the evening they run, improving weekend service. But then over time, the RIDE just passed a long range plan. They also hope to do some things like bus rapid transit. If there are opportunities for dedicated transit lanes, they're going to try to explore those. And so we'll be supporting them in those initiatives. They're going to first test feasibility and look at ridership projections and, what the impacts to the other road users are going to be. So that, it's not going to be a cakewalk to get there by any means, but it is something that's on the city's radar as well as the RIDE's radar. And then, we also partner with our local nonprofit and advocacy groups as well, like Walk Bike Washtenaw, formerly known as the Washtenaw Biking Walking Coalition. they have a countywide focus, and so they often will look to connections between Ann Arbor and Ypsi. When we put in the bike lane on East Packard, for example, they use that to springboard into conversations with the road commission about if there are opportunities to run that facility further to the east of 23. So it's important for us to kind of be a resource to partner agencies like Ypsilanti or Walk Bike Washtenaw to help advance some of those regional connectivity opportunities. All right, let's see how we're doing on time. This next slide is pretty packed full of information, and I'll probably go down a rabbit hole if I start speaking to it. So I see there are some questions that have come up. I'm going to zip through this next slide. If there's interest in coming back to it, I can. What this does is it takes the 5 pillars that I just talked about at a high level and drills down a layer deeper and kind of identifies like 20 of the sub-strategies identified in the plan. But the plan is available online, and so I won't bore you as a talking head by going over all those. So allow me to just kind of quickly scroll through them, and you can just follow along in terms of what some of the sub-strategies are in the transportation plan. All right, and then I think this might actually be one of my last slides, but I do want to get to the questions. So let me, yeah, so that wrapped that up. I do see a couple questions in the chat, so let me go ahead and get to those. Thank you for your patience for those of you that entered them a while ago. All right, yeah, so Jordan kind of confirmed that, believe it or not, sure enough, as a New Yorker, you can definitely have more people in sidewalks and bike lanes than you can in a single occupancy vehicle travel lane. Roberta asks, what counts as a transportation cost in this metric? That may, when I saw that pop up, I think I was on the slide related to housing and transportation costs. I might have to get back to you on that, Roberta. It's a national index. Actually, if you go to, I think if you just type in H+T index, they talk about the methodology that's used, and you can kind of go in that. You can even drill down by community. I don't know if it'll go down to the parcel level, if you can like query your address, but I think it does it by census block groups and census tracts. So there's a lot of good information there, and you can look at communities across the country. So since it's a metric that we kind of borrow from someone else that does it, I'd have to defer to them. All right, Jocelyn asks, are there plans to add a bus route that circles downtown area? I'd love to take the bus to work, but the 5.5 miles I need to go takes 50+ minutes. And the only option is to travel downtown and then transfer. Driving only takes 10 minutes. Yeah, Jocelyn, that's a great point. I will say, in the communities I've worked in, I've worked in Florida and Indiana and Nevada and now Michigan. Transfers, especially for, when you have a really mature transit system, if you think about places that have subways or like a really dense bus network, transfers are not a big pain point because, if you only have to wait 5 minutes for the next bus or 5 minutes for the next subway, that connection is made seamlessly. But when you have a system that's, smaller like ours, where maybe there are 30-minute headways, if you miss that connection, then yeah, it takes a really long time and it's a pain point. In Ann Arbor, we have what we call a hub and spoke system, which pretty much means a lot of the buses kind of converge at the Blake Transit Center downtown and then kind of go back out, which works really well if your destination is downtown or is kind of central campus. But it is difficult, like and I'm lucky enough that I do benefit from that. I work downtown, so I take the bus regularly. But if I had to transfer to then go in the opposite direction I just came, then, to your point, yeah, it would take 50 minutes perhaps or more. I am hopeful that with some of the improvements that the ride is suggesting, that there are going to be some opportunities for that. I haven't heard of any plans for a downtown circulator. I think there used to be one before I came to the city. I heard of a pilot. Actually, there is a small one running right now. If you've seen them, the A2 Go are kind of a downtown circulator autonomous vehicle that you can hail through an app on your phone. It's a limited demand response route. It's kind of defined within a smaller geographic area. It won't take you wherever you need to go. It kind of operates within a sort of small subset of downtown. So there, I mean, there's a small circulator, but it's not kind of a traditional circulator. But I think, there are opportunities for improvement. I know these are at the forefront of the ride and some of the planning that they've done. Again, if you want to learn more information about that, the city and the ride are separate entities. The ride has its own governing body. I actually used to be on the board of directors for the ride, but recently stepped down last year. But they do have a very ambitious 2040 long range plan that if you're interested in learning more about what the vision is for the ride, you can go to theride.org and look up their long range plan, and they'll kind of address some of the questions about, improving reliability and service and connections and things like that. All right, next question is, we have lower speed limits in Ann Arbor, but do we actually enforce those limits effectively? Does the transportation department coordinate with the police department? Yes, we do coordinate. I will say, like many departments, or like I'm sure all of you, sometimes you're stretched a little thin. So there are, capacity issues across the city, including the police department, in terms of enforcement. And so what we oftentimes do is enforcement can be request driven, right? So there is a enforcement request online that folks can make, that if you experience speeding down a road, you can put in a request for some enforcement activity. A lot of times what they'll do first is put out one of those temporary radar speed signs. Even if those speed signs don't look like they're working, they're actually collecting data. And then the police department will assess like what percentage of drivers might be going over the speed limit. And if there are any kind of real outliers, like people who are really, really speeding and causing a dangerous situation. But kind of more importantly, what we recognize is, enforcement does have its limitations on all the reasons that I just said. And so, we're trying to see if there are other opportunities to encourage people to drive slower, to drive the posted speed limit based on some of those quick build deployments, like I mentioned earlier. Are there paint and post projects we can put up? Can we paint things on the road? Can we put plastic delineators down? Can we put up signage? Are there certain things we can do to really encourage that behavior, encourage that compliance with driving the speed limit? And we're hopeful with some of these new funding sources, we're going to experiment with some. To be determined. I'm still working on this $3.8 million grant agreement with the feds. I'm still waiting to see what's eligible and what's not eligible. We just got that announcement about a month ago, and so we're probably a couple months out from signing and executing the contract, just based on how long these things take. But hopefully you'll see some more and exciting things in this space that I don't want to disclose yet, because I want to make sure they're eligible first. But yeah, definitely a good question. All right, what data do you use to decide where to put bike lanes? Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of this has to do with, when we build out the bike infrastructure, we want to create a network that connects people to the places that they want to go. And so while we recognize we may not be able to put a high comfort, all ages and abilities bike facility on every single roadway in town, we want to make sure that we can connect the places, the destinations, the origins, where people are coming from, where they're going to. And the other thing to note in this space too is an all ages and abilities bike facility may look different on different types of roadways. So, a neighborhood street may not really require a, painted bike lane with plastic delineators, right? Because it's in a neighborhood street. But then as we move kind of up the chain of classification of roadway, a collector, which is kind of, the next step up, it may be a lower volume, maybe a lower speed roadway. Maybe you don't need to have the physical separation of a plastic delineator, but you still might want to have some physical space between the bike lane and the vehicle lane if possible. And then when we go up a level to arterials, which might be higher speed or higher volume, we definitely want to make sure if we can put in, that higher level of protection, we definitely strive to do so. So, we have some upcoming projects like on State Street. where we're kind of doing some road reconfigurations, moving some of the parking around to put in some of those higher comfort bike facilities. We also vet these publicly. The transportation plan itself, when we developed those lines on the maps, we went through several iterations as we worked with the community on identifying, what those opportunities were. And we'll continue to make revisions because, sometimes we didn't foresee certain things, 2 years ago when we developed the plan. New things may come to light. There might be new travel patterns out there. There might be new destinations. For those of you that have been following some of the university's plans down at what was the former Fingerly lumber site, Madison, Fifth, Hill. There are 5,000 dorm rooms proposed down there. So that's going to change the whole character of that area and really kind of change the focus of how people get around down there. It's going to make for a very high pedestrian activity area, more so than it is even now. All right, the next question is about scooters blocking sidewalks. They're great for traveling, but can really disrupt accessibility for those in wheelchairs or using other mobility aids. 100% agree, and it is something we are working closely with SPIN on. We have a couple different ways to report such incidents when a scooter is blocking a sidewalk or blocking a doorway, right? That's the other thing we don't want, to block people's ingress and egress out of a building. So, for example, if you're familiar with the A2 Fix-It app, you can report problems on your phone or on the computer by going to A2 Fix-It. And there's a e-scooter, there's a scooter. I think it's called abandoned scooter. There's an abandoned scooter category. You can click that. You tell us where the location is. We send that information to both community services and SPIN, and then it gets addressed. The other thing is, if we find that there's a consistent or persistent problem, we can work with SPIN on higher and better solutions. So one of the things that we've talked to them about, for example, is pushing out messages through their app so that when people check out their vehicles, we're sending out a consistent message about what the expectation is. And then another option is if it really becomes problematic, and I've been speaking to members of the Commission on Disability Issues on this, is we can actually require the scooters and possibly the e-bikes, if that gets approved, to be parked in designated areas. So even though these are dockless systems that don't necessarily need to be chained up to something, we can designate, virtual parking spaces for e-scooters and e-bikes. And so that is something we've already talked to SPIN about, that if the problem persists, it is something we may implement. Now, one thing I will say, and I know I'm going down a little bit of a rabbit hole, we have found that SPIN has been a much more responsive corporate partner in this space because SPIN has local staff that manages the program. Other micromobility, so micromobility is kind of another term for like these small e-scooters, they were crowdsourced, right? So they would come, they would put their scooters on the streets, and then any resident could pick them up and charge them at home if they were a registered kind of, person. But then what that led to is a very kind of haphazard deployment. It led to, scooters kind of being dumped all over the place. And so SPIN, if we ever have a concern, we can raise that to them, and then they're quick to address those. So, to anybody on this call, if you're experiencing a persistent problem, feel free to reach out to me or log it in the A2 Fix-It app. All right, next question is, has there been any thought to adding something like rumble strips or raised reflectors to painted bike lanes to keep cars in their lanes? I live on a street with painted bike lane, and cars seem to see it as just a wider street when they go around corners and they're checking their phones. Yeah, so I think when we talk about these quick build solutions, some of the things that you mentioned are definitely within the realm of possibility. Rumble strips can be a little dicey. They have their application. We've, for example, implemented them at some of the approaches to roundabouts to alert motorists to the possible presence of pedestrians crossing, and then to make sure that they slow down. But rumble strips can also create a little bit of a hazard for cyclists if they're not done properly. So rumble strips in a bike lane condition may or may not work. And then the other thing is we always have to be a little mindful too about rumble strips related to how much noise they generate for adjacent neighbors. because that may turn into a different problem that we need to solve for. But in terms of putting in some of these plastic kind of bumps or posts or things like that, that is definitely something we're thinking about moving forward with. So yes, great suggestion. Are sidewalks being widened in anticipation of more pedestrian traffic? Yeah, that's a good question. I think in certain instances, the answer is yes. So around downtown, we've been working with the Downtown Development Authority on a downtown street design guideline. And we do have, for example, some target sidewalk widths in the downtown area, because sidewalks, especially downtown, are being used for a multitude of things. They might be used for outdoor dining. They might be used for sales racks or things like that, for sandwich board signs. But we also want to make sure that there's enough sidewalk space for the pedestrians using that. I think in terms of neighborhoods or other areas where we might have like constraints on the amount of right-of-way we have or the amount of space we have to work with, there still seems to be a strong desire to keep our street trees, right? So many of our sidewalks in town are, the roadway, then we have what we call the lawn extension, where you might see some street trees or other things, and then you have like a 5-foot sidewalk. I think in most instances, especially in the neighborhoods, that's probably going to be sufficient for the foreseeable future. But in other high traffic areas, we are looking at, widening the sidewalks. So for example, we're currently in discussions with the university about the big dorm project on 5th Street, and looking at the sidewalk width is one of the very things we're looking at down there, because sidewalks are partially not even existent. Like in front of the old Fingerly site, there's nothing there. So, making sure we have an adequately wide sidewalk to make sure it accommodates the number of pedestrians down there is definitely top of mind. All right, any consideration to combine the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority and the University of Michigan bus system? Next question. I think it's been talked about. I don't know of any serious considerations being entertained by either entity. I think there are reasons to combine them. There are reasons to keep them separate, and the reasons to keep them separate seem to be the ones most held by those in control of those systems. So again, I could probably elaborate and spend a couple hours talking about that, but it's probably best that I don't. All right. Then there's a question about, let's see, traveling just west of Maple, south of 94. I think this might speak to maybe a question from earlier about, what are the opportunities to, if you're coming from outside of town, if there isn't adequate bus service, and you may not feel like you have a lot of good options aside from driving. I think that's a fair point. One of the options, though, that I think is sometimes overlooked, or at least with people I've spoken to, are some of our park and ride systems. So, for example, the city, in partnership with the Ride, actually the Ride, I think, takes lead on them, has a series of park and ride lots. So the idea is especially for people driving from outside of town, you come into town, park on the outskirts of town, and then take a bus into the Blake Transit Center into downtown. So again, that might work for folks who are headed to downtown or close by, and still be able to maintain a schedule that is still comfortable. There's talk of expanding park and ride lots as well through the Ride's long range plan to improve those opportunities. And then again, if we improve the other complementary transit service to that, it might become a more viable option for folks both within town and coming from outside of town. All right, how does the city work with Ann Arbor Public Schools to help transportation options to schools? Yeah, that's a good question. We do have regular coordination with Ann Arbor Public Schools. My counterpart at Ann Arbor Public Schools is Liz Margolis, and I talk to her probably about every other week. And yeah, schools can present a challenge. Obviously, we are very sensitive to children, walking, biking, and busing to school, because they are very vulnerable. Especially, the younger they are, the smaller they are, the harder they are to see among motorists. I will say just a weird tangential comment here. I've always been somewhat dismayed by the attitude of some parents that maybe are driving poorly around schools, that, if they just took a moment to think that, would they really drive that way if their kid was crossing the street? Would they really block that crosswalk? Would they really cut off that cyclist if that was their kid? And I sometimes think, I've seen the enemy and they are us, right? When I think about the driving that happens around schools, because it's people going to the school to drop off their kids. So what we are trying to do is look to improvements for crosswalk safety. We want to look to opportunities to reduce speeds around school so that, again, when speeds are lower, motorists have a higher, they have a better opportunity to stop effectively, even if, someone darts out, it's just physics, right? That the reaction time of the motorist and the ability for that vehicle to stop is greatly improved the slower that vehicle is going. And then, God forbid, if a crash were to happen, the slower the vehicle's going, the less chance there is for severe injury. And so that's really our approach. We're trying to find those opportunities. Sometimes we have not a lot of room to work with, and so we try to see if there are things we can do, bump outs, speed humps, things of that nature through our traffic calming program, especially if they're adjacent to schools, some additional signage. It is something that we're constantly working on, and there's still a lot of room for improvement, but it is ongoing coordination that myself and Arbor Public Schools do on a regular basis. All right, next is, will the public school bus system be part of these updates? No, the school bus system is run independently. My understanding is those are contracted out through a third party, their bus drivers. And so, they have their own kind of system. It's not necessarily integrated with Ann Arbor Transportation Authority or Area Transportation Authority or University of Michigan. It's kind of a third busing element. I know there have been other communities. Actually, when I was in Las Vegas, we were looking for opportunities to consolidate that on certain routes. I will say that the way school buses run are differently than the way municipal or city buses. I mean, again, they're not city buses, but the way like the ride buses run. The ride tends to run on arterials, whereas school buses kind of go deep into the neighborhood because first of all, a lot of our elementary schools are in neighborhoods. And so while I know some kids may take the ride buses, like especially those that go to community high school. When I'm on the bus, I see a lot of high schoolers get off at my stop and walk up to community. That may work for some, but the way the system is constructed now, it probably can't work for all schools, especially like when you think about elementary schools. So I can't assert that there's any work in this space in the short term, but it is something that, again, as we build up our systems, there might be some efficiencies that can be gained across multiple systems if those get realized. So that's a long way of saying not a lot. Have you considered raised crosswalks like in Europe? Yes, we have some. Right now, those are implemented as part of our traffic calming program. I didn't go into traffic calming, but we have a whole program that is resident initiated. So, if you live on a street in Ann Arbor and you have concerns about how fast vehicles are traveling down your street, if you and a whole bunch of your neighbors sign a petition, we will come out, work with you on a solution set that hopefully you find acceptable. And that includes raised intersections, that includes raised crosswalks, so those are what we call vertical devices, or things you drive over. And then there's a whole suite of horizontal devices, or things you drive around, like chicanes, like bump outs, like curb extensions, things like that. And so what we try to do is really triangulate what the pain points are of the community and then come up with a solution set that would address those pain points. So we have done raised crosswalks, and we are contemplating expanding that program beyond just the existing traffic calming program to a major street speed management program. So we're working with a consultant right now on what are the measures we can do to bring speeds down on our major roads, like our arterials, like our collectors. And some of the solutions include raised crosswalks, includes raised intersections. So more to come in this space. If you want to find out more about our speed management program, please go to the website that you see here, a2gov.org/vision0. About halfway down the page, you'll see a speed management. We have a whole draft toolkit that we're working on. We were taking public comments up through last week. I think it closed on February 28th. We're going to make refinements based on those public comments, and then you'll see another round of opportunities for engagement. So if this interests you, Crystal, by all means, please follow that. All right. There was a lot of confusion about the city's rule to stop for pedestrians at crosswalks and not just people in the crosswalk. Has that improved? We still get stuck waiting for traffic at several crosswalks without the RFB. Yeah, so the city has a fairly progressive crosswalk ordinance, which pretty much says that motorists are supposed to stop for a pedestrian who intends to cross before they actually step out into the crosswalk. So I think that's what this question is getting to. I think, you know, my impression is, you know, there may be confusion. So I don't want to discount that fact, but at the end of the day, when a pedestrian is in a marked crosswalk, the regulatory device, in other words, the thing that motorists and pedestrians have to follow, is the paint on the ground. It's the crosswalk itself. The yellow flashing lights are just a warning device. And so we encourage pedestrians to push that yellow light because that's why it's there. It's to help bring some prominence to them crossing. But really, you know, a pedestrian still has the right of way, even if there isn't one of those yellow flashing lights. And so once that pedestrian is in the crosswalk, or whether they're about to be in the crosswalk, really a motorist should take care when they approach any crosswalk and you know, make sure they're stopping for those pedestrians. So, you know, while I suspect there is some confusion about those inches between when a pedestrian is at the curb versus when they're in the crosswalk, you know, at the end of the day, a motorist, when the pedestrian has the right of way, if they're at a crosswalk where, you know, they have the right of way, right? So what I'm trying to make the distinction here is that, like, at a signalized intersection where, you know, the pedestrian has its pedestrian signal, you know, obviously they're supposed to wait for their pedestrian signal. But if it's a sort of unsignalized intersection, whether it has the yellow flashing lights or it's just a plain, you know, pedestrian crossing sign, or if it's just white stripes on the road, a motorist is expected to stop for that pedestrian. Are there any regional connectivity projects that include cities other than Detroit? Yes, to a certain degree. If you look at the RIDE's long-range plan, they have identified kind of a catchment area for Ann Arbor, like to the communities to the north, like, you know, Brighton, for example. We have communities within Washtenaw County, you know, Saline and Dexter and others, in terms of how we're getting people to and from the community. And then we also continue to have discussions about, you know, rail and the Amtrak service, and, you know, getting people to and from Detroit and Chicago, and, you know, what are their opportunities to improve the train station as well. So some of those discussions are being had. I will say those are longer term improvements. Those are harder to solve for because they're multi-jurisdictional. They're harder to solve for because, you know, in terms of how we define those catchment areas, you know, so for example, my sister lives up in Brighton, and downtown Brighton is a very, you know, cute place, but, you know, where would you kind of catch people on a bus, for example, to bring them from Brighton down to Ann Arbor? Would it be downtown Brighton? I don't know, maybe. Would it be at an off-ramp, you know, where a park and ride exists? Maybe that's where it makes sense. So I think a lot of those kind of complexities, you know, trying to really serve as many individuals as possible is the hard part to solve for. And it's not an easy task for the RIDE and for the partners that they'll engage, but it is on the horizon as something to solve for. So stay tuned in that space, but it'll probably be several years out before we get there. All right, follow-up question about Ann Arbor Public Schools. Drive children to school because there isn't an option for kids to take the bus because you don't live in the current bus zone. Could current school traffic be mitigated by adding more school bus routes? Yeah, I think, you know, the school bus route situation, it's hard for me to speak to that because I don't know quite as much about that. I know, for example, I have a neighbor, we're zoned for Slauson, so my daughter catches a bus at the our local neighborhood elementary school, but our neighbors go to Open. And so like they have a bus that originates here as well, but it's sometimes not as reliable, and it just kind of depends. I will say finding drivers has been difficult. So when I was on the ride board, they were trying to scale back up operations as we were coming out of the pandemic, and it was very hard to find drivers for the ride. And I've heard similar accounts for Ann Arbor Public Schools as well. I will also tell you this is a very difficult thing for crossing guards. We often get requests for crossing guards around schools because, parents observe motorists not behaving well, especially when their children are in crosswalks and they want crossing guards. If you think about the type of job that is, right? It's crossing guards or even school bus drivers. You have this window where you work in the morning, and then you have this window where you work in the afternoon. And that might only be, attractive or a viable option for certain people. So I think when you think about bus drivers, or when you think about these atypical work schedules, it's harder to find people to fill those slots. Even if there's budget, even if there's interest, they're not always easy things to fill. So Crystal, I wish I had a better answer for you in terms of, what those options are in terms of, school busing and what those improvements look like. I know Ann Arbor Public Schools is always kind of tinkering around with the walk zones versus the school bus zones versus these other things. And, in terms of our job, what we try to do is make sure that there are options for folks. And I know sometimes those options don't work for everybody the same, but we're trying to kind of level the playing field as much as possible so that those that do want to take these other forms of transportation, that, they're comfortable, they're safe, and they're attractive to everybody, including people with children. All right, I think we have gotten through the questions. I'm happy to stick around for a little while, or Kristen, I don't know what the protocol is in terms of closing remarks or transitioning. So happy to do whatever you all would like me to do next.
Thank you. Let's give it a few, just another couple of minutes for questions. If anyone has any closing thoughts, and then you're the only presenter this evening, so that can be sort of the end of it. So we'll give it just a few more minutes just in case.
And thank you, Laurel, for the kind words. Appreciate that. There's still a lot of work to be done. You won't hear me say mission accomplished anytime soon. I joke that they did all the easy stuff before I got here, and they left all the hard stuff for me. So.
All right, so I think that's great. We can wrap it up. Thank you, Raymond, for your time and your presentation, and thank you to all of the participants for attending tonight. Please reach out if you have any questions, and we will be back next week with more Community Academy.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity. Take care.